Something is wrong and everyone knows it, but nobody says it out loud. Believers everywhere are drowning in Bible knowledge while dying of thirst for God Himself. The prayers happen, the church attendance continues, the scripture reading stays disciplined, but late at night when the noise finally stops, the soul confronts a devastating truth. Knowing everything about God has somehow replaced actually knowing Him. This is not about losing salvation or backsliding into sin. This is far more subtle and far more dangerous. This is about becoming an expert on someone while remaining a stranger to them. Faith has turned into information management instead of intimate relationship, and the gap between what gets displayed publicly and what gets experienced privately grows wider every single day. Most people recognize this disconnect immediately but have no idea what to do about it. They keep showing up, keep going through motions, keep maintaining appearances, while internally sensing that something essential has been lost along the way. The real question is not whether this describes current spiritual reality. The real question is whether anyone actually wants to do something about it, because fixing this problem costs everything most people are unwilling to pay. There exists a moment in every spiritual journey where the noise dies down, obligations pause their relentless demands, and suddenly the soul confronts an uncomfortable truth. All the theological frameworks carefully constructed over years of study cannot manufacture intimacy. All the ministry accomplishments stacked like credentials cannot bridge the gap between knowing facts about someone and actually knowing them. This realization often arrives late at night when defenses lower and honest questions surface. When did conversations with God become monologues? When did His voice become a distant echo rather than a present reality? When did faith transition from passionate pursuit into comfortable routine? These questions pierce through carefully maintained facades because they expose what religious culture rarely addresses directly. A person can master scripture, lead congregations, speak eloquently about divine mysteries, and still maintain careful distance from genuine encounter. The heart recognizes this distance even when the mind refuses acknowledgement. Consider how relationships work in everyday life. Someone might know extensive details about a celebrity, memorize their biography, follow every interview, analyze their work with scholarly precision, yet never experience actual friendship. Information creates the illusion of connection while maintaining safe distance. Many approach God with this same pattern, accumulating knowledge as insurance against vulnerability. Theological precision becomes armor protecting against the terrifying invitation to be fully known. Scripture describes something entirely different from this careful dance of proximity without presence. Genesis reveals God walking in the garden during the cool of the day, not to conduct inspections or deliver lectures, but simply to be with those He created. Sin disrupted that communion, introducing shame that made hiding seem safer than remaining exposed. Humanity has refined this instinct ever since, developing sophisticated methods of appearing close to God while maintaining protective barriers against true intimacy. Think about learning to swim. Reading books about proper technique provides valuable information. Watching videos demonstrates correct form. Memorizing stroke patterns prepares the mind. But none of these activities replaces actually entering the water. Standing poolside with encyclopedic swimming knowledge while remaining completely dry illustrates how many engage with faith. The information feels substantial. Discussions about proper theology flow naturally. Debates over doctrinal nuances demonstrate intellectual engagement. Yet the person never gets wet. Never experiences the vulnerability of trusting water to hold them up. Never feels the panic of going deeper than comfort allows. Never discovers that strength comes from surrender rather than control. Jeremiah 17:10 speaks of a God who searches minds and examines hearts, not gathering evidence for prosecution, but seeking what lies beneath constructed surfaces. This search terrifies those who have learned that safety requires keeping certain chambers locked even from divine inspection. Familiarity breeds something dangerous in spiritual life. The words become so familiar they stop carrying weight. Prayer turns into recitation rather than conversation. Scripture reading becomes information gathering instead of transformation. Church attendance shifts from anticipation to obligation. This transition happens so gradually that recognition comes late, often triggered by crisis or emptiness that refuses to be ignored. The soul still believes all the right things, still affirms doctrinal statements, still participates in religious activities, but the trembling has ceased. When was the last moment Scripture produced genuine awe instead of intellectual agreement? When did worship last disrupt carefully maintained composure? When did prayer move beyond agenda presentation into actual listening? These questions reveal how comfort becomes intimacy's greatest opponent. Jesus spoke clearly about this pattern in Matthew 16:24, inviting followers to deny themselves, not merely behavioral adjustments or moral improvements, but fundamental surrender of self-definition, personal ambition, and the cherished illusion of autonomous living. This invitation rarely gets accepted because the cost appears too steep until hunger for something real overwhelms attachment to safety. Moses spent decades in faithful service before asking to see God's glory in Exodus 33. Years of miracles, leadership, obedience, yet still hungry for more. Familiarity with God's power had not satisfied the deeper longing for His presence. He had witnessed the plagues humbling Egypt, watched the Red Sea split in supernatural display, received commandments written by divine finger, spoke with God face to face as Scripture describes, yet none of this produced satisfaction. Instead, each encounter intensified hunger for something deeper, something beyond miraculous displays and authoritative instructions. The response came not through explanation or theological instruction, but through divine positioning. God placed Moses in the cleft of the rock, teaching that intimacy cannot be manufactured through effort, but requires placing oneself where God passes by. This imagery matters profoundly. Moses did not climb higher through personal achievement. He did not earn divine proximity through superior obedience. He simply allowed himself to be positioned in the place God prepared, protected by the hand of God from glory that would overwhelm human capacity. This pattern appears throughout Scripture, not rewarding spiritual achievement, but responding to genuine hunger. Matthew 5:6 declares blessing upon those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, making no mention of those who master religious systems or perfect theological frameworks. Hunger disturbs equilibrium, refuses satisfaction with substitutes, will not be pacified by lesser offerings. This explains why comfort functions as intimacy's primary barrier. Comfortable faith never reaches desperately, never pursues recklessly, never abandons everything else for the one thing necessary. Hunger creates willingness to leave safety behind, to position oneself vulnerably, to wait patiently in the cleft of the rock, rather than demanding immediate gratification or controlling the encounter through personal effort. Many avoid deeper pursuit because intimacy threatens carefully constructed self-images. Faith culture sometimes encourages believers to present polished versions of themselves, projecting strength while hiding struggles, displaying confidence while concealing doubts. Social media amplifies this pressure, creating highlight reels of spiritual victories while editing out the messy processes of growth. Church environments can inadvertently reinforce performance, celebrating success while creating subtle shame around honest admission of weakness. This performance eventually becomes exhausting, creating disconnect between public presentation and private reality. Living split between who others believe someone to be and who that person knows themselves to be produces internal fracture that deepens over time. David understood something profound when writing Psalm 139:23-24, inviting God to search his heart and reveal offensive patterns. This was not masochistic exposure, but recognition that wholeness requires vulnerability. The same David who committed adultery and murder still wrote psalms inviting divine examination. This demonstrates that intimacy does not require perfection, but honesty. Intimacy demands permission for God to access what has been protected, managed, controlled. Those who learned survival required emotional independence find this prospect threatening. Past wounds taught that exposure invites exploitation, so walls went up for protection. Religious performance allowed continued participation without risking genuine connection. Scripture consistently reveals God drawing near to the brokenhearted according to Psalm 34:18, not the self-sufficient. Pretending strength keeps real help at distance. Admitting brokenness opens pathways for healing that self-sufficiency blocks. The walls built for protection eventually become prison walls, keeping out both harm and help, creating isolation that faith was never meant to produce. Imagine gardening in rocky soil. Seeds get planted with genuine hope, water gets applied consistently, sun provides necessary warmth, yet growth remains stunted. The problem lies beneath the surface where roots cannot penetrate hardened ground. Many spiritual lives mirror this pattern. Surface activities appear adequate. Religious participation continues reliably. Yet depth remains impossible because the soil of the heart has not been broken. This breaking feels like destruction rather than preparation. Old certainties must crack. Comfortable assumptions must shatter. Protected places must be exposed. The process resembles demolition more than development, which explains widespread resistance. Yet without this breaking, roots cannot reach the depths necessary for genuine transformation. Jesus spoke of this in Mark 4, describing how shallow soil prevents lasting growth. Quick emotional responses replace deep character formation when vulnerability gets avoided. Powerful moments of divine encounter sometimes interrupt ordinary life. Worship services where God's presence becomes tangible. Scripture passages that suddenly illuminate with personal relevance. Circumstances that demonstrate undeniable intervention. These moments awaken awareness of what intimacy could become. However, many mistake these experiences for destinations rather than invitations. Israel encountered God's power throughout wilderness wanderings, witnessing miracles that should have cultivated deep trust. Yet Exodus 20 reveals their response when God invited them to the mountain for direct encounter. They chose distance, preferring Moses mediate relationship rather than risk personal dialogue. This pattern persists wherever admiration replaces intimacy, and leaders become substitutes for personal pursuit. Powerful moments serve as doorways, not dwelling places. They demonstrate what is available, not what is automatic. Depth requires intentional pursuit beyond temporary encounters. Before continuing deeper, pause here for just a moment. This content matters too much to consume passively. If these words are resonating, creating recognition of patterns in personal experience, take a second to engage. A simple like communicates value, a comment creates connection. Staying present rather than scrolling away demonstrates intentionality. Intimacy with God grows through attention, through choosing to remain engaged when distraction offers easier paths. This small action mirrors the larger principle being explored. Walking with God eventually looks less dramatic than initial encounters suggested. Genesis 5:24 describes Enoch walking with God, offering no spectacular achievements or miraculous manifestations, simply consistent companionship. This stage confuses those expecting constant emotional intensity or perpetual supernatural intervention. Roots grow silently beneath the surface while visible growth appears minimal. Yet this stage produces the deepest transformation. Daily decisions begin reflecting divine priorities without conscious effort. Obedience becomes natural response rather than grudging compliance. Discernment develops through sustained exposure to God's voice until distinguishing His leading from competing influences becomes intuitive. Walking with God reshapes perception, realigns desires, transforms reflexes. This happens gradually, imperceptibly, like an accent changing through years in a new culture. The dramatic moments that initially marked spiritual life give way to steady companionship that proves more sustaining than intermittent excitement. Consider how trust develops in human relationships. Early stages require conscious thought, careful evaluation, deliberate choice. Over time, trust becomes foundational rather than effortful. The person no longer constantly assesses whether their friend will keep promises or protect confidences, because consistent faithfulness has established deep security. Walking with God cultivates this same settled trust. The anxious questioning that marked earlier faith stages gradually quiets, not because certainty eliminates mystery, but because sustained relationship builds confidence in God's character, regardless of circumstances. Proverbs 3:5-6 instructs trust with full heart, rather than leaning on personal understanding. This instruction makes sense only after walking long enough to witness God's faithfulness through confusion, pain, disappointment, and unanswered questions. Trust grows from history, not theory. Love emerges naturally from sustained proximity, not manufactured emotion or forced sentiment, but genuine devotion that flows from knowing and being known. John 14:21 records Jesus connecting love with obedience, not as proof requiring demonstration, but as fruit developing organically. This stage marks a significant shift. Earlier faith stages negotiated boundaries, questioned requirements, calculated cost. Love stops negotiating and starts delighting in alignment. The question transitions from what is permitted to what pleases God. This is not fear-based compliance or performance-driven effort, but desire for closeness that makes separation painful. Sin grieves primarily because it disrupts intimacy rather than damages reputation. This is what Scripture calls fear of the Lord, not terror that cowers, but reverence rooted in affection. Psalm 111:10 identifies this fear as the beginning of wisdom, suggesting maturity involves properly valuing what matters most. Think about how priorities reveal values. Someone might claim health matters deeply while consistently choosing habits that undermine well-being. Words express one thing, while actions demonstrate another. Love for God faces similar testing. Claiming devotion means nothing if choices consistently prioritize comfort, convenience, control. Real love protects relationship above all competing interests. This becomes visible in small daily decisions that nobody else observes. Choosing integrity when dishonesty offers advantage. Speaking truth when silence seems safer. Forgiving when holding grudges feels justified. Serving when recognition will not follow. These moments reveal whether love has become foundational or remains theoretical. The heart guards what it truly values, and guarding intimacy with God changes everything about how life gets lived. This is not legalism or performance, but lovers protecting what they cannot bear to lose. Few believers progress beyond love into complete surrender, because this stage confronts the final illusion of self-ownership. Galatians 2:20 captures this reality in Paul's declaration about no longer living for himself. Union with God does not erase personality or eliminate individuality, but fundamentally reorders authority. Personal ambition, need for validation, desire for control, all the subtle ways self-rule operates, must surrender. This is not dramatic sacrifice or heroic martyrdom. but quiet death to the assumption that life belongs to the one living it. Most resist this stage not because it seems unattainable, but because it demands releasing the last protected territory. Union means God stops being consultant and becomes decision-maker. Plans get surrendered. Timelines become negotiable. Preferences yield to purposes beyond personal understanding. This level frightens those who equate surrender with losing themselves, not recognizing that true self gets found only by losing it. Imagine tightly clenched fists holding treasured possessions. Opening those hands feels like loss, like abandoning what provides security and identity. Yet closed hands cannot receive anything new. They remain full of what they already possess, unable to grasp greater gifts being offered. A child clutching worn toys cannot accept the better gifts a parent offers because releasing what is familiar feels too risky. The known, even when inadequate, often seems safer than the unknown, even when promised by someone trustworthy. Surrender operates this way. It feels like death to what defines existence, yet creates space for life beyond imagination. Romans 12:1 describes offering bodies as living sacrifices, emphasizing that this is reasonable worship, not extreme requirement or unreasonable demand, but appropriate response to who God is and what He offers. The word reasonable matters significantly here. Paul suggests that when understanding who God truly is and what He has done, total surrender becomes the only logical response. Still, most balk at this point. The cost finally appears too great. Better to maintain safe distance than risk everything for complete union. Better to know about God than surrender everything to know Him fully. This hesitation reveals what the heart truly values. Words declare God's importance, but choices demonstrate competing loyalties. The things clutched tightly reveal what feels more essential than intimacy. Career ambitions, relational control, financial security, comfortable lifestyles, personal preferences, all the territories still claimed as belonging to self rather than surrendered to divine authority. These are not inherently wrong, but when they prevent full surrender, they function as barriers between the soul and its Creator. The journey toward intimacy with God does not conclude with neat resolution. Questions persist rather than answers. Loose ends remain rather than tidy conclusions. This is intentional, not insufficient. The path keeps stretching forward, always inviting deeper, always offering more. Where has comfort replaced hunger in personal spiritual life? Where has familiarity dulled the reverence that once characterized worship? Where has religious activity substituted for genuine encounter? These questions do not accuse. They invite. They create space for honest evaluation without demanding immediate transformation. The invitation remains perpetually available, never forced, never pressured, quietly persistent. True intimacy with God costs everything, which explains why so few pursue it fully. Yet for those who taste even small portions of genuine communion, nothing else satisfies. The choice belongs to each person. Surface faith offers safety, predictability, control. Deep intimacy demands vulnerability, surrender, trust. Knowing about God provides intellectual satisfaction. Knowing God transforms everything. The path remains open, waiting for those willing to exchange distance for closeness, information for transformation, comfort for communion. Where does that path lead next? That depends entirely on hunger, on willingness to pursue what matters most regardless of cost, on choosing depth when every instinct suggests safety. The destination cannot be described adequately because words fail to capture what can only be experienced. But this much remains certain. Those who seek will find, not because God hides Himself, but because He responds to pursuit. And the invitation keeps echoing across every comfortable compromise, every familiar routine. every protected place where control still reigns. The question each person must answer is simple but profound. Will knowing about God remain sufficient? Or does communion matter enough to release everything else? That answer determines whether spiritual life stays shallow or reaches depths where transformation becomes inevitable, where His presence becomes more real than circumstances, where intimacy replaces all substitutes. The choice waits, patient but unavoidable, in every moment between now and the end.